Super. Aaron, I'm so honored to be a guest with this program. Thanks to you and Coulter Mercado, and thank you all for joining. It's very gratifying when you work for years on a book on a niche topic that, most people, when they ask you what you work on and you tell them, they kind of make a face. Oh, that's interesting. Well, you can tell they're kind of thinking like, what the heck is that? To see these comments and to speak in front of a virtual room full of people who are so interested in Edirne and Sephardi Jews and the Ottoman Empire is really cool. So thank you all for coming out. So I'd like to begin these talks by reading the first page and a half of the book because I got no better way to introduce the topic. Believe me, I I thought long and hard about this, and this is the best way I can sort of open the topic. So here it is. This is the book we're going to hear about: the Jews of Edirne, the end of Ottoman Europe, and the arrival of borders. Oh, should I share my screen right now, Aaron? Yeah. All right, here we go. Thumbs up if you can see this. Looks good. Okay. The best view of Edirne, Turkey, is from Greece. Should you find yourself approaching the border town of Castanjes on European Route E85, scan the checkerboard of brown and green fields to the east. Beyond Greek Castanjes, chestnut, and Turkish Karaağaç, elm, between the Thracian plain in the foreground and the Stranja mountains in the background, a massive four-minaret mosque looms on a hill over the sleepy borderland, pompously overdressed for the occasion. This is Selimiye, the dominant feature of Edirne's otherwise modest skyline. Upon its completion in 1575, Selimiye was the largest mosque in the Ottoman Empire. By choosing to build his namesake monument in Edirne, the former capital, instead of Istanbul, the contemporary one, Sultan Selim II may have been recognizing Edirne as the empire's second most important city. After all, it was the frequent home of the Sultan's court and the staging ground for military campaigns that had pushed the imperial frontier to the meadows between Budapest and Vienna, 700 miles away. Historians list several factors that could have motivated Selim II to build his namesake mosque in Edirne, but improving the view for people in a foreign country is not one of them. With a population of 180,000, Edirne is now a secondary city, known mostly for its monumental Ottoman architecture and its border checkpoints with two European member states, Bulgaria and Greece. Its difficult passage from central city to border town started in the 19th century, when the Ottomans began their piecemeal retreat from Europe. By 1908, an official state border existed just north of the city. Over the next 14 years, that border would move back and forth across Edirne, wreaking havoc in the process. When the Ottoman Empire officially dissolved in 1923, the city found itself in a new country called the Republic of Turkey. At that point, the border stopped moving, but the borderland continued to be a place where, quote, the future is always uncertain, as a local Jew had said in 1910. For Edirne residents, the first decades of the 20th century were largely defined by the shifting position and meaning of the state border. Compared to their Muslim and Christian neighbors, the Jews of Edirne, both the city and the larger province, experienced the border in ways that tended to be less bloody but more complex. On the eve of the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, Edirne province was home to one of the world's oldest and largest communities of Ladino-speaking Sephardim, Jews who trace their lineage to medieval Spain and Portugal. These people dodged a series of ethnic cleansing campaigns that targeted Muslims and then Christians in the period 1912 to 1922, excuse me. But in 1934, Jews across the region, which had come to be called Eastern Thrace, were attacked by neighbors in a week of violence that prompted a Jewish exodus from the borderland, but killed no Jews. The so-called Thrace events, Trakya olayları, remain the only case of mob violence against Jews in the history of the Turkish Republic. How did Edirne's Jewish community survive the horrors of the last Ottoman decade only to unravel during the relatively peaceful years of the early Turkish Republic? That is a central question of this book. The answers have much to do with the border, the identities it could and could not generate, the violence it could and could not legitimate, and the survival strategies pursued by local Jews within this tricky matrix. So here uh, is the image I was describing. I wonder if it matches with um, what you had in your head as I read that opening paragraph. This is indeed a photograph of Edirne from the Greek side of the border. And I think and I hope in that opening we heard some of the main themes of this book and some of the main themes of the talk that you're about to hear. A central place becoming a borderland, the uneven effects that this process had on different ethno-religious groups, and the complicated relationship between Jews and violence in this part of the world. Let me give a shout out to my friend, the artist Cem Dinlenmiş, an Istanbul-based artist who I worked with on these maps. Um, there's 5 maps that actually start out the book, and I'm going to sort of structure my talk around these 5 maps. You can see, by the way, this is the aforementioned Selimiye Mosque, the um, the iconic feature of Edirne. So let's start with the beginning. In chapter 1 of the book, I emphasize that for much of its history, Edirne was an extremely diverse place in the heart of Ottoman Europe. As we see here, until 1877, the city of Edirne was hundreds of miles from a foreign country. Meanwhile, the province had a Christian majority. So Greece, the only state border on this map, indicated by the thick broken line, is with Greece. You can't even see the borders with Austria-Hungary over here and Russia in this direction. This thinner broken line is just the border of Edirne province. By 1908, Bulgaria had officially seceded from the Ottoman Empire, and a recognized state border ran just north of the city of Edirne. Still, the province continued to be a place of striking ethno-religious diversity, even by Ottoman standards. It was home to about 620,000 Muslims, 340,000 Orthodox Greeks, 120,000 Bulgarian Christians, 26,000 Armenians, and 24,000 Jews. Intercommunal violence was relatively rare, but daily life was very much structured along ethno-religious lines. For example, the Jews of Edirne were governed by Ottoman authorities, but also local Jewish councils and a regional chief rabbi, the chief rabbi of Edirne. If a Jew fell sick, he or she would probably be treated by the local Bikur Cholim Society, the Society for Visiting the Sick. Jewish children attended Talmud Torah schools, or increasingly, schools run by the Alliance Israélite Universelle, an international Jewish organization based in Paris. And poor relief came largely from within the Jewish community. Much of the funding for these institutions came from the largesse of Jewish merchants and a sales tax on kosher foods. Meanwhile, the border of the Ottoman Empire remained relatively easy to cross in the early 20th century. Edirne Jews continued to visit Bulgaria, a young country that was home to many of their fellow Ladino speakers and even family members. In fact, the train ride to Plovdiv, Bulgaria, which I think you can see my cursor, was probably easier than the ride to Ottoman Salonika, today Thessaloniki, Greece. The latter entailed a long stop in Drama, where the Ottoman authorities disinfected the train cars, inspected documents, and recorded the names of all passengers. In Southeast Europe, circa 1908, the boundaries between Ottoman provinces, or ethno-religious communities, were no less formidable than the borders between states. That is to say, compared to today's world, state borders were relatively easy to cross, and the boundaries between provinces and ethno-religious communities were relatively firm. Bulgaria declared its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1908, but more famously, that was the year of the Young Turk Revolution. After a group of officers and bureaucrats forced the Sultan to restore parliament and reinstate the Ottoman constitution, Edirne's Muslims, Christians, and Jews celebrated the dawn of a liberal era. Intercommunal unity, ittihad in Turkish, became the watchword of the revolution, and new freedoms of the press and association allowed newspapers and clubs to proliferate. What emerged, however, was not a general public sphere so much as several public spheres, plural. Muslims read newspapers printed in Turkish, Orthodox Greeks read newspapers printed in Greek, Bulgarian Christians had papers in Bulgarian, Armenians had them in Armenian, and after 1910, local Jews had a newspaper published in Ladino, sometimes called Judeo-Spanish. Ladino was the language of Balkan Sephardim and was printed in Rashi Hebrew letters. Perhaps that parenthetical isn't necessary with this audience, but just in case. Called La Voz de la Verdad, the voice of truth, Edirne's Jewish newspaper urged its readers to see themselves as, quote, Ottoman and Jewish at the same time, end quote, as members of both the Pueblo Otomano and the Nación Judía, the Ottoman people and the Jewish nation. According to the editor, Joseph Bar Yitzchak, these two roles were perfectly compatible because defending the interests of the Jewish community involved exercising the rights and freedoms granted by the Ottoman Constitution. Maybe some people in this audience can even sneak a peek and a quick read at some of these articles here. In fact, Edirne Jews were so emboldened by the promises of the revolution that a Jewish protest in 1910 erupted into a shootout between protesters and police. Miraculously, no one was killed. Several Jews were arrested, but all were eventually acquitted. The Edirne incident, as it was dubbed by the Jewish press in Istanbul, became something of a Rorschach test. Some saw in it the government's commitment to the rule of law. Others saw it as a sign that Jewish political activity in the Ottoman borderland could not exceed certain limits, even in an age of liberty. People saw in it what they wanted to see. In terms of political energy and population size, Edirne's Jewish community reached its peak in the years following the Young Turk Revolution. But by the fall of 1912, this era was coming to a close. The pivotal event was the Balkan Wars. When a coalition led by Bulgaria and Greece attacked the Ottoman Empire, Edirne's Bulgarian and Greek speakers suddenly became suspect in the eyes of their Turkish-speaking neighbors. The arrival of Muslim refugees from the Balkans only reinforced the idea that local Christians no longer had a place in Edirne. But with no enemy state claiming to represent them, local Jews faced fewer questions about their political loyalties. Not zero questions, but fewer questions compared to their Christian neighbors. Some of them made strong displays of their Ottoman patriotism. For example, many young men fought in the Ottoman army, and one even became the first Jewish officer in Ottoman history. This was a young man from Kirklarli, a town just outside of Edirne. Another example of local Jewish patriotism can be seen in this photograph, which also graces the cover of my book. It shows two Jewish women volunteering with their Muslim male colleagues at Edirne's military hospital during Bulgaria's siege of the city. So, this woman on the left is named Angel Giron, and on the right we have Rosa Avigdor, who, after getting married, later would become Rosa Mitrani. Their patriotism was soon recognized in an official letter of gratitude from the governor of Edirne province, the Vali. A funny story. This photograph is from the digital library of the Alliance. And in the process of preparing the book for publication, I was getting permission from the director of the archive and a high resolution photo to use for the cover. And he responded to my email. So I never knew. I knew from other documents. I knew from Angel Giron's diary, in fact, which is one of the best sources we have about the Bulgarian siege of Edirne, that these two women were named Angel Giron and Rosa Avigdor. But I didn't know which was which is a shame, right? When I was getting permission and the high-res photo from the Allianz archive, the director said to me, "Yeah, sure, I can send you the photo. Which version do you want? The one with or without the captions?" I said, "There's a version with captions?" He said, "Yeah, sure." And he sent it to me. And lo and behold, there's a version that has like written at the bottom in Ottoman Turkish, which, if you don't know, is written in like Arabic letters, um, corresponding to where each person is sitting. Their names are written. So I was at the 11th hour able to learn that, in fact, the woman on the left is Angel Garon, and the woman on the right is Rosa Avigdor, later Rosa Mitrani. In March 1913, Bulgarian forces finally occupied the city of Edirne. The Ottoman forces capitulated. Local Jews had little choice but to accept that they now lived in a region called New Bulgaria. Despite her pro-Ottoman sentiments, the aforementioned Angel Garon adjusted quickly to the new reality. Her responsibilities as director of the local Alliance Girls' School compelled her to work with Bulgarian Jewish leaders in a wider effort to reorganize the school network and rebuild the region. When Ottoman forces retook the city a few months later, Giron wrote a joyous entry in her journal. She celebrated the return of the Ottomans, but she also noted that the Ottomans could learn a thing or two from the departing Bulgarians. For example, the Slovak occupiers had quickly required all business to be done in Bulgarian, while the Ottomans, in contrast, had never forced people to use Ottoman Turkish. The Turks are more tolerant, she wrote, but I believe they are wrong, at least regarding language. Their non-Muslim citizens would be more attached to the Ottoman nation if they spoke the language of the Ottomans. This quote, by the way, I found in a different version of her journal. The most famous version, again, lives in the archive of the Allianz, but I found another version in a yearly publication put out by I think it's called the Hirsch Hospital in Salonika. Um, and it's under a pseudonym. It doesn't say Angel Garon, it says Ben Israel, but it's almost the exact same document as her journal in the Allianz archive, give or take a few small differences. There's a few entries that are only in the Hirsch Hospital almanac version, and this was an entry that was only in that version. So pretty sure she wrote it, but it's not in the version of the journal at the Allianz. While the Ottomans managed to reclaim the city of Edirne, the Balkan Wars and their aftermath left tremendous scars on the region. The Ottomans lost most of their Balkan territory. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims fled that zone, and a similar number of Ottoman Christians were forced out of the Edirne region and Western Anatolia. In Edirne province, the Jewish community was about the only group not subjected to campaigns of ethnic cleansing at this time. Surrounded by a swirl of violence and compelled to adopt a more cautious style of politics, we might say that the Jews of Edirne were in the eye of the storm. And indeed, I do say that. Eye of the Storm is the title of chapter 3. For Muslims and Christians, the border was becoming a sorter of ethno-religious groups, each of which was supposed to have its own state, according to the political logic of the time. In contrast, local Jews still did not see the border as a limit to their zone of belonging, and they continued to associate and identify with Ladino speakers across the Balkans. What is true today was already true then. Borders mean different things to different people. Sadly, the Edirne region would continue to be gripped by violence. This map shows the region in 1915, after both Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire joined World War I on the side of Germany and Austria. In a bid to get Bulgaria to join the Central Powers, the Ottomans gave their neighbor a strip of land on the west bank of the Maritsa River. That, combined with the territorial losses of the Balkan Wars, caused the border to almost surround the city of Edirne. So again, here's the city. Now the border is sort of closing in on almost all sides. It was in this context that the Armenian genocide, which started near the Ottoman border with Russia in the east, reached the Ottoman borderland near Bulgaria. I hope my pointing lines up with what you're saying and it's not flipped. Throughout Edirne province, and especially in the port city of Tekirdağ, over here, Armenian citizens of the Ottoman Empire were rounded up, loaded onto cattle cars, and sent to die in the Syrian desert. Contemporary Jewish sources are largely silent on the episode. Presumably, Jews were afraid to write anything that might inflame the Ottoman authorities at this time. This is very overlooked, strangely. By the way, I've seen almost no mentions of the Armenian genocide in Edirne province. It is even a book that is one of like the authoritative books about the Armenian genocide that says Armenians were not deported from Edirne province, which seems to rest on some misunderstanding, some misreading of one of the sources. But it's pretty clear from the sources that I found in Edirne that indeed local Armenians were deported to die in the Syrian desert, and this belies the apologetic narrative that, well, and this narrative continues to be sort of the official narrative of the state of Turkey. Well, it wasn't a genocide because there was no intent. It was the fog of war. And yes, many Armenians were killed near the Eastern Front with Russia, but there was no intent to commit genocide. This seems to belie that narrative because we have the opposite border, as far from the Russian front as you can get, just about. And Armenians, specifically Armenians, not Jews, are being deported. World War I was hardly a good period for the Jews of Edirne, as evidenced by the fact that wealthier community members were leaving the borderland for Istanbul. But once again, Edirne Jews did not become victims of ethnic cleansing. In fact, they sometimes proved useful in the Ottoman-Bulgarian wartime alliance. For example, the above-mentioned Joseph Bar Ishaq temporarily left the newspaper business for a job at the Ottoman consulate in Bulgarian Karaj, just a stone's throw from Edirne. Before long, he was sent on a diplomatic mission to Sofia, over here. After the Ottomans lost World War I, the Edirne region, now called Eastern Thrace, was again occupied by a foreign country. But this time, it was Greece, not Bulgaria. The Greek annexation, and this is, by the way, where word choice gets very interesting. In my book, sometimes I say Greek occupation, sometimes I say Greek annexation. Um, but what's clear is that unlike Smyrna, which was an occupation, um, the Edirne region was officially part of Greece, according to the international community. It was legal by, you know, according to the great powers. And there are maps that show this as part of Greece. I don't think there are any maps that show Izmir as part of Greece. The Greek annexation of Thrace became official in the summer of 1920. In nearby Kavala, a local Jew spoke the following words at a public celebration. From Epirus to Edirne, over 300,000 Jews wildly applauded the victories of this valiant and heroic people, Greek people. Today in Thrace, the sun shines brighter. Over the entire region flies this blue and white striped flag. By the way, I found in the archives, I found that speech in two different places. Once I found it written in French, once I found it written in Ladino. Which language did he give it in? Your guess is as good as mine. The Greek flag, however, would not be the only blue and white banner to appear in Eastern Thrace around this time. Zionism, which had been slow to take hold in Edirne during the late Ottoman period, quickly gained popularity among local Jewish communities, only to vanish from public life when the Greek occupation ended in 1922. The Greek administration largely approved of Zionism, which was seen as a fellow nationalist movement fighting for secession from the Ottoman Empire. After 1922, it would be hated by the Turkish government for the same reason. Zionist societies appeared in eastern Thrace as early as 1919, when the region was visited by a representative of the Zionist Federation of the East, based in Istanbul. By 1921, the city of Edirne was home to chapters of Shivat Zion, Return to Zion, Tzereit Zion, Youth of Zion, Bnei Zion, Sons of Zion, and Banot Zion, Daughters of Zion. When the British Mandate for Palestine was ratified in 1922, 3,000 people filled the Great Synagogue of Edirne to celebrate. Elsewhere, I've read that the maximum capacity of the synagogue was 1,000. I don't know, maybe people just really crammed in. Young members of the Maccabi Sports Club wore their blue and white uniforms, and the Jewish orphanage brass band played the Greek national anthem, followed by Hatikva. However, this was a largely symbolic Zionism that had more to do with local factors and practical considerations than a Jewish state in Palestine or official ideology coming out of the World Zionist Organization. Constant political flux and uncertainty about the future pushed many Edirne Jews toward a version of Zionism that provided a neutral path in treacherous political terrain. In a disputed borderland, where the only political certainty seemed to be the presence of a nation state, as opposed to any particular nation state, Jews employed a vague form of Zionism that was useful less for what it meant than for what it avoided, namely other nationalisms. For the Jews of Eastern Thrace, modern nationalism was not an exciting chance to break with the past so much as a dangerous, obligatory game in which the safest strategy could be a modified version of Zionism that evoked old patterns of communal autonomy from the Ottoman era. So this map looks more or less like today's map. Obviously, Yugoslavia is no longer a country, but the border um, between Edirne, Bulgaria, and Greece looks like this to this day. To an extent, this Jewish strategy of avoiding other nationalisms by focusing on Jewish nationalism paid off when the Greeks, both the military and everyday civilians, were ousted from the region by the Turkish national movement. When Edirne became part of the new Republic of Turkey, and this is fall of 1922, local Jews could plausibly claim that they had not been pro-Greek so much as pro-Jewish. With that said, Zionist activity ceased or was forced underground during the first decade of the Turkish Republic. From 1923 to 1933, the Jews of Edirne experienced pressure to assimilate in the cultural realm and resentment in the economic realm. Still, this was a relatively peaceful time compared to the period 1912 to 1922. Here's a photo also from the digital library of the Alliance. Um, I'm assuming that they're Jewish cheesemakers. I think the caption in the Alliance archive just says like cheesemakers, 1920s or 1930s. Given that it's a Jewish archive, I think it's fair to assume um, that either all or maybe some of them are Jewish. It could be, maybe a Jewish-owned operation, and certain employees were Muslim. We don't know for sure. Cheesemaking was a sort of stereotypically Jewish occupation in the Edirne region at this time. So the interwar period, or we could say the decade 1923 to 1933, this period of relative peace would not last. In the summer of 1934, after an official from the Turkish government toured the region and met privately with local leaders, the Jews of Eastern Thrace were attacked by their neighbors in a week of violence that spurred a Jewish exodus from the borderland, but not the country, not immediately. As I argue near the end of the book, the violence was caused by a perfect storm of factors, including local dynamics, international anxieties, about borderland minorities, and a long Ottoman tradition of population management in the Balkans. And I think elsewhere I say, I wrote an article for a journal called Anti-Semitism Studies a few years prior. Obviously, these are anti-Semitic attacks, but anti-Semitism is not the explanation so much it is the thing that needs to be explained in this context. In a region without a history of deep cultural anti-Semitism, we need to explain this. And that's what I strive to do in chapter five, looking at several factors, both local and international, that kind of mixed disastrously in 1934. The so-called Thrace events, Trakya Olayları, remain the only case of mob violence against Jews in the history of the Turkish Republic. It is no coincidence that they occurred in a geopolitically sensitive border zone. A process that had started around 1912 was completed in 1934. The borderland was now untenable for all large groups of minorities. Today, no Jews live in Edirne. So I'd like to end the official talk there to leave time for questions, which I think will be the most fun part of this session.
Thank you very much for that. We actually have a very hard and very good question right off the bat in the Q&A. And just as we're getting into this, I think one of the things that was really fun in the chat was someone was bringing up, Batsheva was bringing up the point about it was interesting to see the Ladino at this point still being in Rashi. I was interested just because I saw that it was in Rashi and not Solitreo. So we put a little bit of that in the chat. We'll also follow up with an email at the end. But getting to folks' questions, we have a great question in the chat or the Q&A, which is if there's no record in the Jewish archives of Armenian deportations from Edirne,
Hmm.
then where does the author come to the conclusion that they were indeed deported from there?
Other consuls. So one is the Austrian, I think it's the Austrian ambassador, or I think the consul. And I think there's also a Greek diplomat. Foreign diplomats are the ones who wrote that this was happening. And then there's other, and there's reflections of it in just the demographics, and then sort of, they claim these foreign diplomats claim that like thousands of Armenians are being deported. And then if you look closely, sure enough, like when you read like the census for these towns a few years later, there are like no Armenians. Later, some would return. The population sort of, there's a little bit of an up and down or down and up. Um, but there's really, there's no, let's put it this way, aside from actually some false claims by historians today, when you look at primary sources, like from the time, there's zero documents saying um, no Armenians were deported from Edirne, and there are several documents, especially by foreign consuls, saying that they were.
Great, thank you. This one is going to be a little bit more, I think, not a test of knowledge between things. This is a question that was in the comment, which is just there's a Turkish Jewish historian, Naim Avigdor Guleryüz, and there was just a question of whether he may have been related to Rosa Avigdor, or if that's just a
You
connection by
know,
name.
it's a good question. I am familiar with his book. Maybe. I mean, the answer is maybe. So there are some names, as probably many of you all know, there are some names that are very common to like certain regions of the Ottoman and post-Ottoman world. There are a lot of Avigdors, there are a lot of Mitranis, Gerons. Some of these names come up again and again. Danon. So, it's hard to say. I don't know for sure. Maybe at least distantly, but how closely, I don't know. I don't know.
Got it. Thank you. Also, Rachel's making some great points in the chat, which I just very much enjoying seeing. I will say one of the comments she makes is about the pro-German sentiment following World War One, and I find that to be really interesting. I think I brought this up in other lectures, but the Jewish Daily Forward, which published in Yiddish, was very pro-German to the point that they were almost shut down in World War One. And there was a Ladino newspaper called El Adelante, which is the Forward in Ladino, that was publishing the exact opposite. It was a very pro Ottoman Empire, pro Russia, seeing that as the known evil, which is kind of interesting. And both were socialist institutions. Just kind of a funny thing. Neither here nor there. I'm just responding to that comment. And as other questions come in, I'll take a moment and just ask a question I think that was of interest to the Jewish Language Project, which is there any evidence of how the imposition of these new political borders in affecting the use, preservation, or even decline of Jewish languages such as Ladino in the region, particularly Edirne?
I mean, there's no doubt that the imposition of new borders was a blow to Ladino. I mean, in multiple ways, because I mean, it breaks up this community of Ladino speakers, and then also, Jews find themselves in nation states where there's pressure, to say the least, to speak, the official national language. So in Edirne, so we see both of those forces at work in Edirne. It's harder to visit or keep in touch with fellow Ladino speakers in Greece and Bulgaria across the border. And beginning in the 1920s, in like 26 or 27, there's something called the Citizen Speak Turkish campaign, Vatandaş Türkçe Konuş. It started by students in Istanbul Law School, but it spreads to Edirne, where young people, students especially, I mean, you know, Turkish Muslim um, young men are going around, like sort of like parading through the streets, hanging up signs, carrying placards, urging minorities to stop speaking their minority languages in public, at least, and to only speak Turkish. And these campaigns are especially geared toward Jews speaking Ladino. So there are great pressures to speak Turkish instead. In fact, after a few years, you'll even see Jews, like people from within the community, publishing articles for other Jews saying like "Vatandaş Türkçe konuş," citizens speak Turkish. Hey, let's only speak Turkish in public. So yeah, I mean, you see these forces working on two levels, breaking up the traditional cultural zone and and then within the new zone, Turkey, Greece, Bulgaria, intense pressure to speak Turkish, Greek, Bulgarian. I'll say something since you mentioned Solatreo, Aaron.
Hmm.
I did come across Solatreo documents in my research as well, and it was painstaking to read at first, but I eventually got the hang of it. And for those of you who don't know, this is like the Ladino cursive. Um, in the central archives for the history of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. This is where the Edirne rabbinate and the sort of official communal archives now live. I found some correspondence between Jewish merchants. I think this was in the 20s, after 23. Um, there's like some sort of Jewish firm trading agricultural commodities such as I think like chicken feed, and they're riding in Solatreo from like Edirne to I think it was Salonika and even to Vienna and to Plovdiv. Different agents in his company are writing to each other. Um, and there's other Solatreo documents that kind of made their way into my source base as well.
No, thank you for that. And we're starting to get a lot of questions in, which is great. Uh, I'm going to take one from the comments and then we'll go into the Q&A. One of the ones that I think is a very interesting one from Yaron Levy is by the mid-1930s, Yaron's grandfather had gone to Jerusalem from Turkey, and you had mentioned during your talk that there was growing anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist sentiment in Edirne in 1923.
Yeah.
He was curious, how long did it take to spread to Istanbul, if you kind of have a sense of that?
I think this anti-Zionist sentiment was not unique to Edirne and simultaneous. I think after 1923, there was anti-Zionist sentiment in any Turkish city with a sizable Jewish community. And Zionism basically went underground in most Turkish cities after 1923. Maybe it was especially acute in a border zone like Edirne, where people are especially sensitive to, the geopolitical situation and not trusting, being wary of minority movements that involve like getting their own state, right? This is an especially sensitive topic in Edirne where people watch like Bulgaria break off and the border to the west get redrawn. But it's not an Edirne specific thing. And I think the answer is it's simultaneous.
Mhm.
Istanbul and Edirne. As soon as the Turkish Republic is founded, um, Zionist expressions have to be done basically underground.
Got it. Thank you. There's a very interesting question, and maybe this isn't the end, but the question that came through is, when do we see the end of the Jewish population in Edirne?
Right.
Or I should add to that, is there still a Jewish population in Edirne? That's a question I don't know either.
So there's no more Jewish population in Edirne today. I mean, this was a few years ago. Um, Again, I said Mitrani is a common name. There was a family named Mitrani who owns or owned, I don't know what the current status is, a grocery store in Edirne. But the owner would commute back and forth from Istanbul. I mean, that's the closest thing to like a Jew in Edirne that I'm aware of. Um, the Thrace events, the Trakya olayları of 1934 do not like immediately put an end to the Jewish community. It's a blow. Maybe one fourth of the community, which at that time was down to like 8,000, maybe one fourth leave immediately, flee the violence for Istanbul. And then the remaining community like peters out over the next couple decades. I mean, the the Trakya olayları is when the community really loses critical mass.
Mhm.
And it's a matter of a slow unraveling after that. I would say by the middle of the century, the community is really not much of anything, and by the 60s, it's over. And now, um, and even when I started my research in 2015, there were no um, permanent Jewish residents in the city, or maybe even in the province, to my knowledge.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Depressing, but as we've seen in many communities elsewhere, I think an unfortunate shared experience. One of the things that we're getting to that I think, okay, two things. There's this fascinating thing in the comments about this move from Turkey to Peru. That's just really cool. Love hearing that. It's very interesting to read about. And I have many questions for this person in the chat, but that's not what we're here for. But I'm going to have to ask more questions there in the chats. But we do have a question that came in from Marina Mayorski, which I think is also very great, which is, what do you think is unique about the Jewish experience in Edirne compared to that of other cities that moved between different polities in that period?
Hi, Marina. Thank you for that question. A lot of this book, and especially in the intro, like I take pains to kind of set up this Venn diagram, right? On the one hand, I am trying to find similarities across borderlands, or at least the Jewish experience across borderlands. That's a big part of what this book is about, is sort of suggesting that we use the borderland as a framework for understanding Jewish history and for understanding violence against Jews, right? Again, anti-Semitism in many cases is not the explanation, but the thing to be explained. And sometimes Borderlands, I think, can help us explain. So part of it is saying that that there's many commonalities. That's part of my claim. But yes, at the same time, um, the Ottoman borderland is different from the Russian borderland, let's say. And this comes up in chapter 4 of the book. I point out that in the years following World War One, the Jewish experience in the Ottoman borderland is a far cry from that of Jews in the Russian borderland. Notably, the violence that Jews face is nowhere near what Jews will face in what was the Pale Settlement. So there are pogroms. I mean, as many people probably know, after World War One and after the Bolshevik Revolution, um, that the scholar Jeffrey Vlight, Jeffrey Vleidinger, yeah, I think, calls a Holocaust, really. Pogroms that make previous pogroms pale in comparison. And I mean, nothing like that happens to the Jews of Edirne. And so there are some very important differences in this like Sephardi and Ottoman borderland versus this sort of Ashkenazi Russian borderland. Interestingly, I mean, sometimes every now and again, La Voz de la Verdad sort of writes a story about Russian Jews. Nothing about the pogroms that followed World War One, but during World War One, there's an interesting article. So during World War One, the Russian government sort of ironically abolishes the Pale of Settlements and switches policy that does an about face from saying Jews may not move into the Russian heartland to forcing Jews to move into the Russian heartland. There's all these fears that like minorities will be like a fifth column as the Germans invade during World War One. So Jews and others are forced um, inland. And La Voz de la Verdad writes about this, which is very interesting because it's the exact moment that others, not Jews, but like Greeks and later Armenians, are being deported by the Ottomans from this borderland. So it's an interesting kind of subtle commentary maybe on what the Ottomans were doing and just sort of maybe alerting my interpretation is maybe alerting Jews to like what can happen um, to Jews in a borderland during wartime, but it doesn't happen to the Jews in part because whenever like an overzealous local Ottoman authority would sort of get one or two Jews like sort of get swept up in a deportation of Greeks, the Jewish community just sounds the alarm. I mean, and then La Voz de la Verdad, they write these articles. There's one occasion they call it like the Alfasa affair. A Jew named Albert Alfasa was included in a mass deportation of Greeks from the Edirne region. Um, this is wrong. The Ottoman authorities got it wrong. A Jew should not have been included in this deportation. And the chief rabbi um, sends a message to the chief rabbi of Istanbul, who then petitions with Enver Pasha, and eventually the triumvirate, or at least Enver Pasha and Talat Pasha, sort of correct the mistake, and Albert Alfasa is allowed to return home. So local Jews take pains to make sure that the Ottomans don't get confused and include Jews in these deportations. Anyway, full circle, back to Marina's question. That's one very notable difference between, say, the Ottoman borderlands and the Ottoman borderlands at almost the exact same time.
That's fascinating, and thank you. There's another question. This might be our last question. We'll see what we have time for. That's kind of building on this question that you just received. This one is, are there sources showing interaction or political collectivity between the Aegean, Sephardic world of Ottoman Jewry and communities in distant borderlands, the Urmia Jews or Antakya Jews?
Good question. No, not that I have found. And I think I also say in the intro to the book, um, this borderland category, this is me, the historian, laying it onto the situation. As a historian, 100 years later or more, I'm saying I believe that this is an important category and lens for understanding the experience of Edirne Jews. They did not use that word. I couldn't find a Ladino word for borderland. If anyone here knows one, include it in the chat. But in all my reading of these Ladino sources, I never found a word for borderland. Frontera for border, I would see sometimes. But um, this is an interesting difference, by the way, between, and maybe this ties into Marina's question too. Elsewhere in other borderlands, Jews or non-Jews um, may have sort of taken on a borderland identity and consider themselves borderlanders. But I didn't see that in the sources here. And so this is a great question. Do I see like, Edirne Jews sort of corresponding with Antakya Jews and hey, fellow borderlanders? No, I did not see that. And I didn't see that as a category of identity um, for Edirne Jews.
Thank you for that. I will, I don't know again if this is 100% going to back up what you're saying, but I know in El Mensajero, which is a Ladino publication out of Los Angeles, that they have several articles relating to Jews both living in Mexico and the United States using frontera kind of as the border and like being what it means to be a Jew who lives in America, but kind of recognizes or identifies more with Spanish speakers rather than
Yeah.
English speakers of Los Angeles. And that
Well,
comes
I'd
up
love to read it. I'd
sometimes.
love to read about that.
Yeah, I'll definitely share that with you.
That's great.
Let's see. There's a great comment from Alma in the chat here, just kind of sharing a little bit more about kind of name is that trilogy. I like that. And yeah, we very much appreciate everybody. Looks like we have time for one more question, so this will be our last one, and that's going to be coming from Batsheva, which is there a record of music songs out of Edirne, or are you familiar with music specifically to the Jewish community there?
Yeah, great. Yes. So the most famous Jewish music from Edirne would be the Maftirim, and that's a Hebrew word, a Hebrew plural. It refers to both the singers and the songs. Maftarim can be like the choir, the singers, the people, or it can refer to the songs. It's Hebrew poetry sung in Ottoman modes. So it's a very interesting case of sort of like Jewish and Muslim Ottoman culture um, melding. And for whatever reason, Edirne was known as like the center of Maftarim music going back to the 18th century, if not earlier. And there are some books about this and some catalogs of the songs and even some recordings. If you go to like a good university library website and type Maftarim, you'll see not a lot of things will come up, but a few will. Um, and in fact, when Edirne Jews sort of migrate to Istanbul in the 20s, you see in the Istanbul Ladino papers, like very excited announcements about the Maftarim choir. The Edirne Maftarim choir will be performing this Saturday at the Italian synagogue. And the Istanbul Jews are very excited to have this cultural institution move from Edirne to Istanbul. I won't sing. I'll spare you a performance, but there are actually some very nice recordings that you can find.
Awesome. Yeah, I see people are talking and asking more questions in the chat if you want to just add Maftarim real quick for folks. But I will say, as we're closing out, that if you are interested in Ladino music, UC Ladino does have a great kind of program at UCLA. It's a project through the university. They have a lot of both music and history there. So if you're looking for more of that specific element, you should be able to find some things there. There's a woman that I've known for many years. Her name is Simone Salmon. She studies ethnomusicology, particularly Ladino and the Ottoman influence on Ladino music. You can find some of her research also at UCLA.
Wow.
So again, I wanted to thank everybody for joining us this evening. Professor Daniels, it was amazing having you. And for everybody, just want to let you know that as we close out here, uh, if you wanted to be subscribed to a newsletter, we will make sure that you are added. If you didn't, we respect that. We are at this wonderful point in life where people shout into the void. We hope to quietly give you great information and not be one of those people shouting. But everybody will be getting an email regardless following up on this event, just with the recording and with, again, the link to a discount code for the book, as well as some of the other materials we've covered, because there's been a lot covered in the chat. I really appreciate everyone kind of connecting and sharing a lot of amazing resources. And again, a wonderful closeout. Thank you to the Stanford University Press, to the Jewish Language Project, to the American Ladino League for co-sponsoring with Culture Mercado this evening. Thank you again, Jacob, for your work, for this incredible book, and for just being so willing to kind of be here and talk us through a lot of really fascinating parts of Jewish history. And to everyone in the comments, I am so happy so many of you connected. I'm seeing a lot of like the Jewish geography being played out, and I really appreciate seeing that all the time. So thank you, everybody. And I'll leave it open for probably another 30 seconds as we kind of log out if people want to kind of save each other's contact information, because I'm seeing a little bit of that sharing going on.
Can I get a copy of the chat or should I copy and paste it quickly myself?
I believe I'll get the chat and I'll send that to you along with the recording,
Great.
and I'll make sure that you have access to all of that. And I do have a couple things that I'll be sending you as well at the end of this, just because people have shared a couple things for you in particular.
Yeah, I'm sorry, everyone. I didn't have time to read everything as I was speaking, but if I could get it later, I'd love to read it and take some time.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thanks again, everybody. And oh, I'm seeing that Jake Kohenak, as we leave, is saying he's going to be meeting you on March 19th in Boca Raton.
We'll talk. We'll talk about
Awesome.
that.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one. Bye.